Hello. Hello and welcome to Arvos with Harvo February edition. Wow, it is the second time I'm doing this video, which means that I have started a project and I may not give up after the first try. That's actually very exciting to me. If you have known me in person, you know just how many things I begin and then never continue. So I am very excited myself. Hope you're excited for me too. It's been a funny month. It really has. The world feels like a different world than what it was in January, and I guess all I can do is just talk about the books that I've read and match it up to how I've been feeling. And maybe 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 20 years down the line, I at least can look back at this and think about how the literature that I've been engaging with at this point in my life is really shaping the way that I see the world. Hopefully, that'll be something that's useful for me and for you guys as well. I've got the lights on because it has been raining for days and days and days in Sydney. I think it's like the second week in a row of rain, and it's going to keep continuing. So I actually hope that you can hear the rain in the background. It's like a nice little quaint thing. Today at work, I spent my lunch break in my car like I usually do because I don't like to take my mask off inside the building. And so I was just reading and listening to the rain patter on the top of my car, and it was just like a really nice experience. Uh, yeah, I don't know what to say. It's quiet. Anyways, let's talk about books. So, these are the books that I read this month. I'm going to try my best to do the clap thing again. Okay, there we go. So, you may notice that there's only 6 books here, and that is because the one at the very bottom has eaten my entire February. I really did not plan this month very well. But I did get through quite a few of these categories. I did find some really interesting reads. Hopefully, March gives me a better opportunity to plan out my time because I was not expecting my February to go this way. Anyways, let's talk about book number 1. Oh my goodness. Crime and Punishment. This took so long to get through. And not that it was boring or slow or painful or anything like that. It was just long. And I think it was also me trying to get back into the routine of full-time work. This edition's quite large, so I can't take it in my bag, and I'd probably look very silly bringing this out in the break room or anything like that. But still, it was interesting because I was reading about 20 pages every morning, 20 pages every night, and I was experiencing the reality of these characters slower than real time, if that makes any sense. Of course, this book's very famous by Dostoyevsky about Raskolnikov, a young Russian student in St. Petersburg who is destitute, he's very poor, he has barely any possessions to his name, and he has the support of his mother and his sister, who are both wonderful people, but they are really trapped by their poverty, and they're not in control of their lives at all. His sister, Dunya, is a servant of rich people, and they often mistreat her, and Raskolnikov has this strong moral compulsion to do something about it because he doesn't like to see suffering in the world. And so he ends up committing this murder. He kills the I'm gonna say landlady, but that's not correct. He kills a pawnbroker who he doesn't see a lot of value in and who he was reliant on before for his income. And from there, the novel becomes really weird and psychological. It explores his efforts to try and stay away from the police and to justify himself to the various people of his neighborhood. And it's not really a spoiler to say that because that happens in the first sixth. It happens in like the first 100 or so pages. It's a very slow novel. But after that, it's really just about the consequences of this kind of action. I would say that not too much happens. This book is really just a sequence of conversations between Raskolnikov and his family and his friends and the police and the various rich people who get entangled with his lives. I really like his friend Razumikin. I think it's probably one of the more popular characters in this novel because he's such a goofball. Like, he's a really intelligent student and he knows what's going on. But there's also this chapter where he's trying to help his friend Raskolnikov, who's got fevers and is not feeling well. And his friend Razumikin is just like, well, I am very drunk right now. I'm trying my best, and I really like this guy, but I am very drunk right now. And it's just, the dialogue is really funny. It is a funny book. I think lots of people have this misconception about the Russian classics being quite dark and dreary and depressing. And this is that, absolutely, very dark and dreary and depressing. But there are funny moments as well. There's a lot in here. And the weirdest thing is that it takes part across, I think, 5 or 6 days, so a very short amount of time. And it took me 3 weeks to read. And that's how I've been told to always enjoy the Russians, is to slow down and really take in all the details. And it's been a very different experience because this edition, which is, I can't remember the translator's name. I really wanted to shout out the translator's name. Translated by Richard Pever and Larissa Volokonsky. Very sorry for the pronunciation of those names. They have elaborations of all the cultural references at the very back of the novel in the form of endnotes. And so I'd always be reading and flicking back to the endnotes and thinking, what do all these things mean, and what are these references to Dostoyevsky's life and his experiences of incarceration himself. And it's a big and complex book, and it took me just a lot of time to get through. I feel very conflicted about it because it's one of the longest books I've ever read, and it has really rewarded me in how complex its depictions of psychology are. But it is also just so incredibly slow, and it's very demanding of any reader. It took me just a hard time to get into the mindset of these characters because we're always hopping around perspectives. A character might say something, and then we find out what everybody else at the party thinks about that one line of dialogue. It really slows things down. And so you need to be in a particular mindset to enjoy this. Ultimately, I still gave it 3 out of 5 stars. I think I'm going to remember a lot of the ideas from this novel, and I'm quite glad that I spent the time with it. I'm quite glad that I saw it to the end, particularly because it does develop, and there are a lot of really interesting ideas that do appear. I just think that you need to be aware of what this is going to be before you start reading it. It is not a light crime novel. Why am I saying that? Of course everyone knows that. But it is something that requires just full attention. It is also interesting to think about Russian culture, and particularly Russian novel styles. I'll fix that in editing. Just the idea that the perspective of the reader and who the reader is supposed to be in all of these events. I feel like in a lot of American and British storytelling, especially American storytelling, it's first person. You follow one character, or even you are one character, and you go through their life and you feel what they feel. Whereas in this novel, and also in a lot of the other Russian literature that I've experienced, the reader is this distant being, and they're watching all of this unfold like a diorama. We find out all the thoughts of the characters, and we're not sympathetic of any of them. Everybody's flawed, everybody has inconsistencies in their personality and in their thoughts, and we're aware of all of that. So the act of reading is just us dissecting these people, which has been quite new to me, and I would love to keep trying that in other books of this style. That being said, I have completely fallen to my hubris because I thought that I could finish this in a month, and I did, but it took my entire month. I had foolishly thought that maybe in the end of the year I would do Middlemarch, or I would do War and Peace even, and I now know for a fact that I cannot do that, because this book, and it's not even that long of a book, it's about 200,000 words, took up just about all of my February. I would need to break up something like War and Peace, which is almost 2.5 times the length of this. I would need to break that up into 3-4 months, maybe over the course of the year even. So, yes, many things to be learned from Crime and Punishment. Book 2 of February, and I started reading this around the same time that I was midway through Crime and Punishment. This is Madeleine Thien's Do Not Say We Have Nothing. This is also a very long book. It's about 150,000 words, and I was conflicted about it, because this was one of the books that I read when I hadn't read that many books. It's one of the few adult literary books that I first started reading because it's on the extension syllabus for the New South Wales HSC. And so I bought all the books on the syllabus back when I thought I was going to be a teacher, and I would read through all of them. And this one really caught my attention, first of all because it's about Chinese history, and I'm Chinese and I'm interested in finding out about that. And also because the writing itself at the time I thought was really lyrical. This was my 20-year-old self who loved similes and metaphors and like had aspirations of being a poet, right? And now older me looks back at it and goes, I don't feel like every single one of these symbols lands. I think that the author goes for a lot. There's a lot of attempts at beautiful metaphorical writing, and at times it absolutely does nail it, but not every time. And sometimes I did feel a bit exhausted thinking, I just want this description of the scene to end so I can find out what happens next, you know? The premise of this novel is really quite fascinating. It's about, well, it's a generational epic across China, looking at Chinese history around the time of the Cultural Revolution, leading up to the 1980s university protests, and then jumping even further ahead to a migrant family in Canada, and looking at how the connections of these characters have reverberated throughout time, how various characters make different choices to illustrate the relationship that an individual has with their country and their culture and the political systems of the time. It's not that complex. It deals with complex themes, but I would not say the book itself is complex. I find it to be actually a very Western novel because, and the author is Canadian, she's writing from a migrant perspective. It's so focused on a small cast of specific characters and their individual wants and desires and needs that I feel like it quite simplifies the political and the economic dynamic of what China was in this time. Not to say that I'm personally an expert in it, but I really went into this book wanting to know more, and I think I've learned more about this one specific dynamic of society. So this book follows, in the Chinese history side, an extended family who are all connected by music. So they love Western, I should really be careful of that phrase, like German and English and French, classical music. They've had family members who traveled the world to study music, or they have been able to promote that kind of music in China and to create Chinese music which follows in the footsteps of those old classic composers. And so that becomes something that is very individualistic. They want to express beauty through whatever language they have, and theirs just happens to be musical notation, which is a fascinating metaphor because in the Cultural Revolution, there was a attempt at changing musical notation for a Chinese audience. So they created something called jianpu, which looks like this, right? They actually have it notated out in the book, which is so cool. They have the numbers and the dots, and that's meant to represent the kinds of notes that you play, and also the duration. Whereas this book also has standard musical staffs, which also explains the tone of symphonies that happened at the time. So there you can see that happening with that. It's such a fascinating metaphor because it's about complexity and simplification, and about what art and music needs to be for audiences. And I think that the Chinese Communist Party comes off very negatively here, and that kind of Western individualistic culture comes out very positively. And that's me trying to read it as impartially as I can. I still think it was good. I still think it was well written. There are lots of very beautiful moments. Actually, the structure is very interesting because it's really following three timelines. It's following a timeline set in around the 1960s, and then a timeline in the 1980s, and then one in the 1990s, 2000s. The 1960s timeline is around the era where Chinese history gets a bit wonky. So there's a lot of myth, and there's a lot of fable, and there's a lack of empirical objective truth because a lot of it is told through rumor and storytelling rather than historical record. And that's something that I quite empathize with and I'm quite familiar with in my own family history. There are some anecdotes here which connect well to things that I've been told my relatives have gone through. And so that was quite valuable to me. But then I think that, I don't know. Midway through the book, it starts going backward. Oh, it's so confusing to explain. The chapters count upwards until midway through the book, and they then start counting backwards down to zero, which is a weird approach because sometimes you can say, oh, but in chapter 7, and there's two chapter 7s, the chapter 7 in part 1 and the chapter 7 in part 0. Anyways, if you know even the slightest bit about modern Chinese history, you know what it's kind of down to. And the emotional effect of doing that, to one side, to me, feels a bit manipulative, but the other side, it totally works. Like, I had this incredible feeling of dread going through the latter half of the book because I was just shook by the inevitability of it all. I'd gotten to know these characters and I'd been invested in their quests, and then, yeah, it becomes quite tragic. So, it definitely works. It's a 4 out of 5 novel. I think if you don't know that much about Chinese history, you will actually enjoy it a whole lot more because it does a great job of explaining how it feels to exist in that kind of political climate. If you are interested in more complexity when it comes to representing geopolitics or the historical period itself, I don't know if there's other books that do anything like this. It's actually pretty uncommon, now that I think about it, to find a novel specifically about late 1900s China. So, it's good. It's good. What else can I say? It's a good book. It's a good book. It's a good book. Why am I making this video? Alright, book number 3 is Ethan Frome. Ethan Frome? I've never said that out loud. Ethan Frome? By Edith Wharton. And this is a very short novella, actually. It's very commonly taught in American high school syllabuses. It's about the length of The Great Gatsby. So, very short. It's about Ethan Frome, this man who lives in Starkfield, this area in New England that's known for being cold and desolate and very unforgiving to its people. And that's mirrored in the kinds of people that he meets. Everyone's very kept to themselves, and Ethan Frome's main tragedy is that the title character really desires a warm and loving relationship, but he doesn't get it from the person that he's married, Xena. His wife Xena is controlling and overbearing and is chronically ill, but there's this implication that she's using her illness to enact control over Ethan. And Ethan's life is really just marked out by work. And so he goes through his routine, he tries his best to make money and to keep the farmstead alive. And then he meets Mattie, who is, I think, Xena's cousin, yes. And she's younger and she brings that youthful desire and energy into his life, and he really, really wants to be with Mattie. And so that's where the overall arc of this story begins. It's very short. It's so interesting going from this novel, which is about 30,000 words, from Crime and Punishment, which is 200,000 words. Like, you could read 6, almost 7 of these in the time you could read Crime and Punishment. And I really wanted this to be longer, because I think I didn't get enough time to really sit with the characters and feel their feelings before then I was asked to sympathize in their tragedy. This is a tragic novel. I don't feel the kind of oppressive atmosphere that Ethan gets when living with Xena, and I didn't also feel the strong sense of joy that he gets from Mattie when they hang out together. We have really just 1 or 2 situations or symbols that convey this, but those long-term relationship ideas are things that need that time to percolate. So I think I had trouble with this one. I am very fascinated in Edith Wharton as a person. I actually didn't know very much about her before I started reading this. In my mind, I thought she was quite similar to F. Scott Fitzgerald because they were both writing around the 1920s and writing about New York. And what I found out was that actually Edith Wharton is old money. She's very well off, but she got this way because of a really difficult relationship. She was married to someone who was also very emotionally distant, just like the story of this novel. And much of her life was about trying to seek happiness despite having the pressures of her relationship and her society placed upon her. And so she writes from a much older perspective with wisdom and wistfulness and longing, whereas when I read Fitzgerald, I get that youthful desire coming out of it. So I'd be quite interested in reading more of her. Maybe something longer, because I think my main complaint about this is that it is quite short to the point where it's just a bit obvious. Like, I see what it's trying to do, and it's fine. That was a 3 out of 5 as well. Alright, book four. This is I Sweep the Sun Off Rooftops by Hanan al-Shaykh. And this is a, a book of short stories by a Lebanese author. And it was published around the 1990s, so it's quite fitting into a very specific cultural moment of the Arabic landscape. The stories here are spread across a number of countries in the Middle East. There are some set in Yemen, there are some set in Lebanon, some set in Egypt, and I find that the connecting idea of all of these stories is this sense of desire. Mostly a feminine desire, but not necessarily always in a romantic one. It's just a feminine desire for something, for romance or for companionship or for knowledge of yourself or for freedom or for growing up or for staying young. Lots of different characters expressing various forms of desire, and at times there is this incredible beauty in some of these short stories, and I was really quite swept away by some of the first person narrators in just how accurately they capture that feeling of desire. Like, I was even thinking about one of the stories today. I wanted to read a small part from the story called The Spirit is Engaged Now. And the premise of the story is that this woman, it's not really a Ouija board. She's like channeling a spirit of a past lover. And at the very end, we finally find out what this relationship meant to her and why it was so important to her. And we get this passage, which is, I used to be possessed with a desire to be near him, even when he was already holding me. I anticipated his kiss while he was kissing me. I was overcome by a longing for him so powerful that it distracted me from enjoying the warmth of his hand as we walked together. I used to wish nature would find a way of joining our two bodies even more closely than when we made love. Like, wow, there's just, lots of incredibly impressive passages. Now that I've read that out, I'm curious if it's meaningful outside of the context of the story, or whether the story itself is about the discovery of what desire means for a human being. Like being able to verbalize that sensation of just needing something, somebody else, or the feeling of freedom, or returning to your hometown, or just anything, that feeling so strongly that it overrides logic. It goes beyond normal human experience. That's something that I've really got out of this collection, is that there are some moments that just absolutely blew the door open, just incredible. Uh, I found it to be actually quite accessible as well. It's translated. It's translated by... I really should check this before I talk about it. It's translated by Catherine Copham. It really doesn't want you to know it's translated. The name's not anywhere. But I thought translated did a fantastic job. It's a bit weird that it feels very marked in its culture. Like, you can see the font and the chapters and story titles and everything have this decal that make it very obviously Middle Eastern, and I don't know how I feel about that one, because it really does color the stories. I don't really know if I would recommend this collection as an introduction to the Middle Eastern setting, but I would absolutely recommend it to talk about how to represent first-person narrators who have strong, strong desires. I think that that's really the great strength of this. I gave it 4 out of 5 because there are some inconsistencies. It doesn't always land. There are some stories which, to me, felt a bit too short, and maybe that's the theme of this month, is that if anything is ever too short, it makes me go, oh, I get it, but I want more of it, you know? And so that's why some of the stories in here that were the longer ones. So there's one called The Land of Dreams, which is about a Danish missionary in Yemen who is trying to figure out why she's there, and then it leads into that desire moment. And then there's that story called The Spirit is Engaged Now, Do You Want to Hold?, which is about speaking with the dead and how you understand your relationship to things that are no longer in your possession. And there's the story called An Unreal Life, which is about a woman who has left her hometown by marrying a Western partner, and then on returning, she has this weird conflicting moment about whether she likes the place that she came from, whether she's betrayed it because she's left for another country. Lots of those conflicting ideas there. I think the complexity in this collection is really admirable. And I think, well, I haven't actually seen anyone talking about this author or this collection, and I really wonder why, because it's very well done. It is a bit old, it's from the 90s, but in my mind, it stands up next to just really good short story collections. To my mind, immediately comes people like Jhumpa Lahiri, or do I want to say Alice Munro? Maybe Alice Munro, I don't know. Both of them get that sense of the relationship to place, but also individuals and psychology that all comes together. So that's all I have to say about Ice With the Sum of Rooftops. Check out a few of these short stories by themselves if you would like, but I do also very much recommend this collection. It was a huge surprise for me. Great read. Okay, book number 5, genre fiction for February, is The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. Now, I love this cover. It's such an interesting cover because I feel like when you are making an adaptation or like a illustration of War of the Worlds, it does its job for you, right? It's like a city on fire and some three-legged robots on top, and that's just so many of these covers. Whereas I really like the abstracts of this one because this is a really abstract novel. I actually couldn't read it outside of its context, which was the 1890s. So before World War One, before World War Two, here's H.G. Wells writing about just a completely futile war where Martians come to Earth and just completely destroy everything because they are so advanced in technology that they don't care about human beings. It's like they treat humans as ants or like a lesser species because they've just advanced so far ahead in time that there's no way to communicate. There's no diplomacy. It's a fairly brutal novel. It feels very modernist to me because it's bleak and it is quite ultimately meaningless in a good way because it's not talking about any themes except the fact that something like this just can happen. Like, there can just be a completely unexplainable, powerful force arriving on Earth and just destroying it one day. And there's no way we could have predicted it. There's no way we could have stopped it. It's just ta-da. And that's scary to me. That's interesting the way they've approached it. And of course, this is one of the earliest examples of alien invasion sci-fi, and it really created all the stereotypes about Martians and other aliens. We've got tentacles, we've got giant mech warrior robot suits, we've got heat rays, we've got black smoke, which I feel like is a really chilling foretelling of the use of chemical weapons in World War One. Just lots of interesting explorations about warfare and invasion. And what's really fascinating to me is that there's this passage early on where the narrator is trying to explain what this invasion must have been like or must have felt like. And he gives the example of the British invasion of Tasmania and the genocide of the first Australians of Tasmania. And he's saying that if we, British human beings, could have done that to their culture, who's to say there is no other culture that could do this to us? Which, for the 1800s, is surprisingly self-aware. I think it's still very imperfect in its representations, of course. It's very much a product of its times, and it has all the stereotypes that you would have from science fiction written by men in the 1800s. But there is that vulnerability and almost a sense of guilt that I interpreted there, that the protagonist doesn't defeat the Martians by any sense of ingenuity. This isn't a heroic novel. It's barely even a survival novel. It's just a novel about the fact that the narrator doesn't die by chance. And that's really humbling to me. I thought that was very interesting. The way that it's written is, I would admit, a bit difficult. It very much assumes that the reader knows the geography of Britain, because it will just say, and then this character went to Leatherhead, and it expects the audience to be like, yeah, I know where Leatherhead is, just down the road from me, right? And so a lot of that didn't have any meaning for me. When they said the aliens were in Surrey, I was like, I don't know where that is. I don't know how close that is to London. I have no sense of tension because of this, right? And I don't feel very strongly about London either. So sure, London's fallen. I don't care. Sorry to anyone watching this who may be living in London, but that's just how this affected me. Is that I had a lot of trouble getting into the setting and also the characters because the first person narrator of this novel is a bit of a nothing. It's like he's a bit scientific, but he also doesn't have much of a personality. He's melancholic. He has a wife who he ships off to another town at the very beginning, and despite the fact that looking for the wife is supposedly the core story arc of this novel, wife doesn't really get mentioned very much, not until the very end. You don't get the sense that she does anything in his relationship aside from just being a wife. I don't know. Just the more I say it, the more underwhelmed I am. I think it's an interesting novel to talk about. I think there's definitely some thematic ideas here which really go beyond what the words themselves are doing. And because it was written in an archaic way and a long time ago, and because the things that it describes are very much now cliches, it's also not a very good thriller because you could just go read a science fiction novel that came out 5 years ago and have a much better time. So I was just reading this for the history of it and really situating what it's trying to do in the kind of historical and political and technological moment that it was written in. That could be quite interesting as a really early example of cosmic horror, especially space-themed cosmic horror, that you can clearly see the influence of. You can see the influence of this in everything from Ridley Scott's Alien or just various other approaches to extraterrestrial life, especially the kind that's more intelligent than human beings. Hugely influential. Not entirely enjoyable, and I gave it a 3 out of 5. Alright, and last novel is the Australian one for this month, David Malouf's Fly Away Peter. This is another very short one. It's only about 130 pages, about 40,000 words, so really more of a novella. And it's so simple. It's incredibly simple. There's a character called... I've forgotten his name. I want to say it's Joe, just because it would be so simple for me to forget. Jim Sadler. So character named Jim Sadler. And he likes birds, but he's not very well off, and he takes a job with Ashley Crowther on their huge property cataloging birds. Noticing birds, taking photographs, writing about birds, and he meets a photographer named Imogen Harcourt, and she is a photographer, and together they have this nice friendship, enjoying nature, talking about birds. That's the first half. Second half, World War One strikes, and Jim is shipped off to go fight in World War One, and that's the novel. It's so simple. And David Malouf is a famous Australian poet, and this is one of his earlier novels, and you can clearly see that poetry to prose transition there because it's very economical the way this novel is written. There is no detail, no scene, no sentence which doesn't seem to push the story forward in some way. It's even quite audacious in the way that it does that. When I read it, I feel the author going, I am not going to give you any details that I don't think matter. So it's really just the complete opposite of Crime and Punishment. It's just razor thin, sharp, and decisive fiction. I think it works quite well. I think it's quite standard as a World War One novel. This was written in the 90s, so a lot of time has passed since World War One, and it does try to establish the Anzac myth and a lot of Australian military history mythos. It does lead quite into that. It is a war as hell novel. It is a nature is nice novel. I think if you had to write an essay about it, you'd be quite underwhelmed because I don't know if the themes are ultimately that deep. But I think the experience of reading it is nice. Mostly because it is so quick and because every sentence is so purposeful that you feel like you're getting a lot out of it. When you read a chapter, even if it's just about descriptions of birds, you learn more about how these three characters see the world. Whether it's Jim, who loves nature and can just make a map in his head of his environment, or whether it's Ashley who owns nature but still has this sense of reverence and understanding for it, or whether it's Imogen who has a much more artistic attitude towards what she's doing. All of this is coming together to form just really beautiful prose, lots of great imagery, lots of great descriptions, and then eventually a war segment, which is fine. It's alright. I've read a few war novels. It's about what you'd expect from a war novel, really. But it's fine. It connects together quite well. It doesn't cost me a lot to read this because I finished it in about a day, and there's lots of good things to like about it. I gave it a 4 out of 5. Alright, and that's my 6 books of February. Didn't get to 7 because I didn't get the chance to read any trash this month. Very sad about that. I even kind of cheated because Fly Away Peter, I finished this on March the 1st. It really was just these 2 big books at the very bottom that took up my entire February. It took me 3 weeks to read Crime and Punishment. I started midway to get into Do Not Say We Have Nothing as well, and that took me another 2 weeks. And then I had 3 weeks to finish these little tiny 4 books, and maybe I'll plan things around better in my March. So let me know what you think. Have you read any of those before, or do you have any thoughts on my thoughts? Have I given them any hot takes? Is War of the Worlds actually terrible and I've been too kind on it? I have heard that opinion quite a bit. Let me know what you think. I will see you guys possibly next month, possibly earlier. I've actually been quite interested in doing literary techniques as well and looking at writing using some of the things that I've been reading, and I think if I get around to it in March, I will make a video about temporality, focusing on Crime and Punishment, because I'm interested in the way that dialogue is able to either speed up or slow down the reader's experience of time, and Crime and Punishment is so slow. It feels so slow. You feel like you've been in this moment longer than the characters have, because you have, right? The book takes place over 7 days, and it took me 21 days to read it. So there were times where I finished reading my session for that day, and a few days later I would be in the same conversation. And that's a really unique experience. Whereas you compare that to something like Fly Away Peter, which takes 40,000 words to expand across decades, right? And continents. I'm interested in how you can express time using various literary devices, especially dialogue. So if I get time to make that, I will, and it will be here. And if I don't, I will see you guys in March. Okay, thank you for watching. Goodbye.